Hey friends, welcome back to the channel and to this special edition Study With Me video. The day starts at 9:30 AM when I wake up in my pod in a capsule hotel in Narita International Airport in Japan. I change out of my smock, have a shower, brush my teeth and pack my bags, ready to fly back to the UK with British Airways Business Class. Very excitingly, I managed to snag the ticket for me and my mum using my air miles accumulated over a 2-year period, along with the buy one get one free companion voucher that you get if you're a big spender on American Express, #flex. We check in and head over to the fancy business class Sakura lounge, where I spend a large amount of time filming stuff and not much time eating the free food. The waitress in the lounge very kindly prepares us a special order of halal beef noodles, which I try and wolf down to maximize the value gained from this ridiculous experience. At 12 noon, we board the plane, I get a cheeky coffee and spend a large amount of time playing around with the fancy-ass features of the seat and lamenting how many air miles this upgrade cost. Just after taking off, I film a few segments for an upcoming potential video review of British Airways Business Class, and my mum and I have a bit of banter with the air hostess, who's very excited that we're both doctors. At 1:30 PM, I bust out my iPad and decide to start some work, but then realize it's out of battery, and so I plug it into the plug socket that's near my seat. While waiting for it to charge, I bust out my Nintendo Switch and play some Witcher 3. I waste a distressingly large amount of time on that, until food arrives at 2:20. The food is pretty tasty, and it's a surprisingly nice experience to eat from glass plates and metal cutlery on an aeroplane. It's now 3 PM, and at this point I reset my watch to UK time, so now it's actually 6 AM. With this realization, I decide to have a nap for a couple of hours and then begin my day of productive studying on the aeroplane. I manage to get a bit of sleep until 8:30, when I wake up and head to the bathroom to freshen up using these fancy toiletries that they gave us for free. After that, I grab some snacks and head back to my seat to start work. At 8:55, I start going through the physiology textbook Levick's Introduction to Cardiovascular Physiology. I'm using Notability on my iPad Pro to read the PDF, with Bear, the note-taking app, in split screen. I start off by writing out a quick outline of all the chapters in the book. This is scoping the subject in action, and it only takes a small amount of time to do, but it pays dividends in the long run because it means that while we're reading through the book, we'll have an intuitive understanding of where our current chapter fits into the bigger picture. After typing out the table of contents, I look through the lecture notes and figure out which chapters in the textbook correspond to which lectures. This information will be really useful later on because as I'm going through the lectures, I'll be able to easily find more information and references in the textbook. From 9:20 AM, I decide to make a start on chapter 3 of the textbook. Often if I'm revising a subject rather than learning it for the first time, I like to not start at chapter 1. The problem with starting with chapter 1 is that it's often really introductory content and feels like a bit of a waste of time. Anyway, I make a start on chapter 3, which is all about the excitation and contraction of cardiac muscle cells. One of the things I love about this textbook is that they have really good learning objectives at the start of each chapter. So, in the first instance, I spent some time testing myself on the chapter's learning objectives, and crucially, I'm doing this before I read the chapter. There's a ton of evidence that shows that testing ourselves with questions before we've even studied the topic leads to greater understanding and retention. This applies even more so to maths and engineering problems. There are lots of studies where students given a set of maths problems to solve before they get taught that subject end up performing better than students who were just taught it straight away and then tested afterwards. Anyway, while I'm testing myself on these learning objectives, I decide to actually type out rough answers as I'm going along. It's very tempting to do this sort of stuff in our heads, but I find that if I'm forcing myself to write stuff out, it forces me to actually think through it. If I just looked at the questions and tried to answer them in my head, I probably would have become super lazy and just thought, oh, I don't know this, rather than actively trying to dredge up anything I can from my memory. And as I've said 100 times in previous videos, it's this very act of dredging up old information that strengthens our memory. And the more effortful it feels to recall stuff, the more cognitive labor we're having to put into it, the more strongly that stuff is going to stick in our brains. At 9:35, I spend half an hour working my way through basically just 2 pages in the book. As I'm going through it, I'm making a note of stuff that's either really new or really important. It's worth mentioning that 30 minutes for 2 pages is pretty slow going, but when we're trying to understand difficult concepts, it can take ages to get our heads around them, at least for me, and there's no substitute for spending that time grappling with the subject and trying to understand it. Once we've understood it, and by that I mean we'd be able to comfortably explain it to a 5-year-old, then we enter the memorization stage, and that's where we can save a lot of time with things like active recall, spaced repetition, interleaving, categorization, and all these other effective studying techniques that I've made loads of other videos about that I'll link in the video description. At this point, after just over an hour of studying, I decide to take a quick break. I bust out my fancy noise-cancelling headphones and spend some time listening to an audiobook on Audible. I'm listening to book number 3 of the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, narrated by the incredible fantasy narrators Michael Kramer and Kate Redding. These days I listen to Audible for 1 or 2 hours a day, firstly on my 1-hour drive to and from the hospital where I work, and also at the gym. With my whole drive for productivity, listening to fantasy audiobooks is my main source of unwinding, and it's a bonus that I can do it while I'm driving or at the gym. Hashtag multitasking. If you don't yet listen to audiobooks, then you can sign up for a free trial of Audible at audible.com/Ali Abdaal, or if you're in the US, you can text Ali Abdaal to 500-500. If you're new to audiobooks, I'd recommend starting with Stardust by Neil Gaiman. He's a fantastic narrator, and Stardust is a lovely story with a nice, wholesome dose of romance. Audible is genuinely one of the most worthwhile purchases I've ever made, and adds an enormous amount of value to my life each month, and I've been plugging Audible long before they started sponsoring my videos, just because I love it so much. If you want to sign up, then please visit audible.com/Ali Abdaal, or text Ali Abdaal to 500-500. The free trial lasts a month, and you get 1 audiobook and 2 Audible originals completely free, so yeah, please go sign up, and thank you Audible for sponsoring this video. From 10:30, I continue going through the textbook, noting down the salient points or the stuff that's new to me. There are a couple of points I want to make here. Firstly, when taking notes, I like to keep in mind that any sort of information is a balance between context and compression. A textbook has a lot of context, but not a lot of compression, which is why reading a textbook takes ages. Shorthand notes have a lot of compression, but that comes at the expense of context necessarily. So here, when I'm writing, calcium initiates shortening via TTM complex. That is a complex process massively compressed into this shorthand. This sentence is going to make absolutely no sense to someone who doesn't understand the topic, but when I read it, I know that it's talking about the troponin-trypomyosin complex that prevents muscle cells from contracting at rest, thanks to the trypomyosin blocking the actin binding site on myosin. And this is all connected to the protein troponin, and troponin responds to calcium ions that bind to one of its subunits, the C subunit, and then that causes a conformational change in the other subunit, the T subunit, that's connected to tropomyosin, and then tropomyosin moves a little bit, and now the actin binding site on myosin is exposed so that the actin can bind to it, forming a cross bridge, and then we've got the whole complicated procedure of cross bridge cycling involving ATP, and that leads to muscle contraction. So that would be the context that I've got from my lecture notes, the textbook, YouTube videos, and I've compressed it into this shorthand, calcium initiates shortening via the TTM complex. In fact, one mistake I used to make when taking notes in my first year of medical school is that I used to have too much context in my notes, i.e. they used to be way too long and almost a copy of the lecture notes. This is something that lots of my friends used to do as well. When we first started medical school, we kept the bad habits that we developed during our GCSE and A levels, where, yeah, you could probably write detailed notes on everything, memorize it all, and get 100% in the exam fairly easily. But at university, that strategy was doomed to failure because there was just too much stuff. One way to deal with that stuff then was to get really good at compressing and trusting that we'd be able to refer to the lecture notes, or to the textbook, or even to Google and Wikipedia if we needed the context in the future. And in fact, almost none of my friends continued the strategy of making detailed notes, and if we made any notes at all, they'd be mega compressed. The second point here is one that I say in every video, that if we look at the evidence from scientific studies, summarizing content, which is exactly what I'm doing here by taking notes directly from the textbook, is a generally ineffective way to retain information in our brains. The key to retaining the information is by testing ourselves on it, i.e. active recall, and doing that repeatedly over a long period of time, i.e. spaced repetition. What I'm doing in this study session is therefore suboptimal, but there are 3 reasons why I'm okay with it for now. Firstly, compressing this stuff actually helps me understand the content in the first place because I can do things like categorize and numericize it and all that stuff. Secondly, I've already tested myself once with the learning objectives at the start of the chapter, and I'm going to test myself on them again whenever I come across this chapter again. And thirdly, I'm planning to transfer these notes in Bear over to the app Notion at some point, and when I do, I'll write questions for myself above each point. For example, here I've summarized the difference in intracellular calcium concentrations in skeletal and cardiac muscle, and how that relates to the determinants of contractility in both muscle types. When I get around to copying and pasting this bit into Notion, I'll write out a question like, what determines contractile force in cardiac versus skeletal muscle? And then, using the toggle feature of Notion, I'll hide the answer so that it'll be easy to test myself next time I'm doing this topic. I normally would have done this the first time around, but sadly Notion doesn't work very well offline, and there's no Wi-Fi on this aeroplane, not even in business class. Hashtag first world problems, am I right? I continue along this vein for around half an hour while listening to my Spotify Study With Me playlist, which you can check out with a link in the video description if you like. By 11 AM though, I noticed my mind starting to wander, and so I decide to stop work for now. From 11 to 12, I dump lots of footage from my camera's SD cards onto my external hard drive, and I go through the photos from my recent trips to Japan and Spain to figure out what's going on Facebook and what's going on Instagram. P.S. Please follow me on Instagram if you aren't already. At noon, I vaguely considered doing some more work, but then I think, nah, screw it. and spend the next 2 glorious hours playing The Witcher 3 on the Nintendo Switch. While playing, I do get a few withdrawal symptoms from wasting so much time, with palpitations in my chest and tingling in my fingers, but I try to tell myself that it's okay to relax at least once in a while. Lunch then arrives, and it's a pretty tasty 3-course meal with tuna and noodles, and then at 2:10 I can't bear wasting any more time on video games, and so I get back to studying. I ask for another cheeky post-lunch coffee to keep myself awake, and then I spend the next 40 minutes continuing to work through this book chapter. At the end of every paragraph, I am, of course, asking myself the 2 classic questions of, firstly, does this make sense? And secondly, could I explain this to a 5-year-old? If the answer to either of those questions is no, then I figure out where the hole in my knowledge is and try to plug it, as it were. Normally, I'd be using other resources like Google and Wikipedia to help plug holes in my understanding, but given my lack of access to the internet, I make do with a textbook. And actually, it's such a good textbook that I don't really need external resources. Around 3 p.m, we get the announcement that the plane's going to land in 40 minutes. I decide to stop working then and get my brother to be cameraman while I showcase some of the fancy features of the seat for my upcoming official review of British Airways Business Class, which, now that I think about it, I might not bother with because it seems the only thing the audience seems to care about is videos about tech and about studying. If you'd be interested in seeing a proper video review where I talk about how much this cost and whether it's worth it, please do let me know in the comments. The plane lands just before 4 p.m, and so ends the business class experience and this somewhat novel, semi-study themed video. I really like the idea of doing study with me videos in unusual locations, so if you like this one then please do leave a comment down below and I'll try and study in more weird, exotic places for your amusement. Thank you so much for watching. Please sign up to Audible with my link because it's really great and also helps support the channel. Have a lovely day and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.